Project number 8, glowing crystal clusters. The original template was designed on Blender and printed out on my 3D resin printer. Once printed, I used isopropyl alcohol to clean it off. The use of a resin printer is very important here because it can produce a much higher detailed print, and that's exactly what I needed for the original, which I'm going to be taking a mould from. I then put it in my UV cooker to allow the resin to finish curing completely. Once it had finished, I used hot glue to stick it to a plastic board and then surrounded it by a paper tube. I mixed up a good amount of silicone with its catalyst, stirring it thoroughly to ensure that the catalyst was well mixed in. I then put it in my vacuum chamber to remove all the air that was in the silicone. You normally don't have to do this with most moulds, but because this mould is going to be going in my pressure pot, I needed to make sure that the increased pressures wouldn't deform the mould. Once all the air had been taken out of the silicone, I poured it over the crystal into the paper tube. Once it had dried overnight, I removed it from the paper container . And after cutting off a little bit of the excess silicone, I removed the print to reveal a nice, perfect mould. The next step was preparing the LED lights and the battery pack. Using 2 high lumen LEDs, I first soldered them together in parallel, that's what that is, using bell wire, which I covered in a light amount of solder. Then I soldered these two to the battery pack, making sure that I'd gotten the wires the right way round, as that's relevant with LEDs. To be honest, I'm not very good at soldering. I'm just about good enough to do this. My hands are far too shaky and my eyesight is going. But I managed to get them all sorted with only losing one LED on the incredibly tidy floor of my workshop. Once we got all that sorted, I stuck the LEDs in place using hot glue. I found it's useful to seal electrics in hot glue simply because not only does it hold it in place, it also ensures that you're not going to cause any shorts or anything like that. I had a bit of a problem with the resin expanding and changing shape when it dried in the pressure pot, because it had an annoying habit of crushing the battery pack when I left that inside the resin while it was hardening. My first solution to this problem was to surround the battery pack with foam before I put it in the mould, ready to have resin poured into it, in the hope that when the resin expanded, the foam would accommodate that expansion and it wouldn't crush the battery pack. This didn't work. I tried using a negative of the battery pack to put in the resin while it was curing, with the intention of taking it out later. Unfortunately, because the resin squished it so much, even with release agents and tape, I wasn't able to get it out afterwards. So I had to resort to using my router. When mixing up epoxy resin, there are numerous different ways of getting rid of the bubbles from the finished product. One way is to mix the resin in warm water. This will make the resin much runnier, encouraging the bubbles to rise to the top quicker. I would advise against using a vacuum pump because I found on occasion this can make the resin react quickly and in weird ways. Best way of getting rid of the bubbles is to use a pressure pot, which squeezes down all the bubbles and makes them virtually impossible to see. I do this at 35 psi using my compressor, and it does the job wonderfully. I decided to make several of the crystal clusters with different coloured pigment and differing amounts of pigment, just to test how this would affect the light within. Shockingly enough, I found that the brighter colours tend to be more transparent, and the more pigment you put in, the harder it is to see the light inside. Shocking, really. By using a specially made jig, which is basically just 2 bits of wood with some foam, I was able to safely hold the crystals in my vise without causing them any damage, while I used my router to cut out a notch the right size for the battery pack and light. This worked excellently, and by testing the exact shape of the battery pack, I was able to remove the correct amount of resin. The only problem is it filled the workshop full of dust, powder, bits of plastic. I will eventually get to cleaning it up. Eventually. For the moment, I'm just using compressed air to clean off all the dust from the crystals. I did this before I gave them a good spray of gloss varnish. This was done to smooth off the surface of the crystals and give them a wonderful gloss luster that made them particularly nice and shiny. Once the varnish had dried, I used hot glue to hold the battery packs in place, giving them a final check to make sure that the lights were still working. To easily get the circumference of the crystals, I just wrapped some tape around, cut that off and measured the tape. And with that circumference, I cut out a length of vegetan leather. I use this because it's much easier to dye. I gave it a generous amount of dye as I wanted the leather to be nice and dark. And once we'd got it the colour we wanted, I cut it into strips. And then re-dyed the edges Once it had been dyed, I sealed it with some acrylic leather sealer. This gives it longer life and stops the colour from bleeding. And then burnished the edges of the leather using a special attachment on my multi-tool. You can burnish by hand by just sort of rubbing it with a bit of wood, but I'm far too lazy for that, so just did it with a power tool. Once burnished, I cut 3 holes on both ends of the straps. And then with waxed thread, I sewed them together in a cross stitch. Once done, I slipped it over the bottom of the crystals and tightened them as much as I could. Tied a knot in it, cut off the excess and burnt off the tips to seal it. And there we go. That's it. It's all you need to do to make some very nice glowing crystal clusters. I actually got particularly inspired and decided to make some wands. And as promised, here's how they came out. Yeah, that'll do.